I'd started getting uncomfortable with the media interviews I was doing. And I was like, okay, so why did you put yourself in that situation again? Whatever comes naturally to me, I sit in it. I don't ignore it. When I was young, like in my head, nothing is impossible to make. And I remember once going for an interview, I hated that I became the token survivor. Yet I had things I wanted to share about what policies need to change.
Welcome to another episode of Her Media Diary, a podcast that captures the lived experiences of African women working in media industries. I am Dr. Yemsi Akimbobola, and in this episode, I'm joined by Adelle Onyango, a Kenyan media personality, radio presenter, podcaster, poet, and activist. With her organization, the Adelle Onyango Initiative, which helps provide free psychosocial support for women who have survived rape, Adelle is proactive about speaking up on sexual harassment and gender-based violence, and most importantly, supporting other survivors like herself. In this episode, Adelle and I look at sexual harassment in the broadcast industry and how she overcame some of the most challenging moments in her life and her career. Now, to give some context, in 2020, African Women in Media and Foyo Media Institute conducted research that looked at barriers faced by African women working in media. One of the most prominent barriers was sexual harassment. And throughout this series, we'll be in conversation with African women working in a range of media industries to discuss the various issues that emerged from the research. By inviting these voices into conversation, we hope to provide solutions to break down barriers faced by African women in media. Before we start though, a quick disclaimer to our listeners. Sexual harassment and gender-based violence is a sensitive topic and one that can be distressing and triggering. In the show notes, we have included links to helplines, support groups, and organizations that specialize in supporting survivors of sexual harassment and violence. All right, so Adelle Onyango, what an absolute pleasure it is to have you on the podcast. I'm so excited because I've known you since 2019 at the conference in AWIM 2019 in Nairobi, and then the world has changed so much since then, and you've done so much amazing work since then. So it's really great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. And I just, first I want to give you your flowers when you can still smell them. Like, you're so inspiring. Remember when we first met, I was just starting my podcast and you did this thing that is so powerful of just like sharing resources about like, you need to check out this site and this site, you need to talk to this person. And I think that's really magical in terms of sisterhood.
Oh.
Just being able to put on another sister to something. I always remember that and I'm so thankful.
Oh, thank you. I completely forgot all of that somehow, but I'm great that I'm grateful that it's helped. And anyway.
Yeah.
So Adelle, you're doing amazing work, podcast, book, so many initiatives. But I really want to get to know you a lot better. So I know that you come from a household of girls. So tell us about growing up. Tell us the backstory of Adelle Onyango.
I like to call like my childhood home Estrogen FM because it was just women. I'm the third born and last born of three girls. And my mom probably practiced the best family planning ever because we're three girls. There's 3 years in between each of us. And
wow.
All our names begin with A. So the first one is Anne-Marie, then Amanda, and then me. And what I found to be very interesting of late is that my mom named me after her favorite news anchor in the States.
Okay.
And then I ended up going in media, which is quite interesting. And for a long, maybe like 10, 11 years of my life, I lived mom, dad, and my sisters. But my dad, I can extend grace to him now, but he had an alcohol problem. He was physically abusive. And so my mom left my dad at a time when it was like not heard of. Like married, when you get married, you're meant to stay there no matter how uncomfortable it gets. Right? And so she left at a point when like the church was, we were Catholic back then and divorce wasn't allowed. I don't know about now. There was so much stigma stigma she faced, and she left with 3 girls and had to take us through school. And I remember my mom even going back to school during this time. And around that time, she was also going through breast cancer treatment. This was like in 1999. And so I say all this just to say the first and most important example of femininity and womanhood for me was my mom. And it was such a strong example. And I think why it's instrumental, and I love that you started this with childhood, is that she met us where we were. And I was the kid who was very creative and loved poetry and didn't do well in math. and my mom didn't.
It's all right.
Right?
So many of us in that
And so
space.
my mom didn't force me to be anything other than myself. And so from a very young age, I was very comfortable being weird. And, when teenagehood, when people are planning to go to the movies and things that like your average teenager does, I'm like, oh, I can't wait to get my hands on this new Jamaican poetry anthology. And it's just like, what the hell?
What the hell?
and so I think that gave me a very strong foundation. And even cancer, I mean, she was talking about having breast cancer at a time where it was stigmatized and you couldn't say it openly that you had cancer. You would lose your job, which ended up happening to her. And she then went on to create and lead the Kenya Breast Health Program, which was like advocacy work around policies on cancer, giving resources to women who couldn't afford chemo, couldn't afford radiotherapy. So she was in the activism space based on her own story. And I think for me, then, going through everything I've gone through in life, it made me not ashamed to like own dark parts of my story and use that to kind of like build something bigger than me. And I think, I think that just my childhood was quite powerful when I think about it now in hindsight,
Yeah, I mean, everything that you said is kind of like around, this woman facing all of these societal stigmas and just facing it head on. So that must definitely have had influence on you in terms of what you then went on to do.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't even think it was conscious. Like when you're silent enough, you can hear your inner voice, you can hear what's comfortable, what you're genuinely passionate about. And I think even the route of taking it, there's so many similarities with my mom, but I wasn't conscious about it. It's like now that I'm older, I'm like, oh, hang on.
You can see how
so many things are so similar. Yeah. So that was a great childhood.
But in terms of your career in media, so I read that you were scouted while you were still in university. Tell us about that. Like, how did you get into radio?
Man, it was not the plan. And I think that's the case for so many people. Like we plan and the universe is just like, good one, but that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Before I went into uni, I really was interested in public relations. And so my mom made me work at another powerful African woman. Her name is Gina Din, and she ran a public relations organization firm. And so I worked there when I was 16. And after I worked there for a couple of months, I was like, this is what I want to do. And I tried to convince my mom not to waste money on school fees for uni, because I was like, these guys will say they'll want to hire me. Like, I have everything I need. And
it now.
Right? And you know how that went down with an African mom. It was just like, are you crazy? And so the good thing is that when I went into uni, then I knew it was media and I knew my course was going to specialize in public relations. And so that's what I did. I only did one broadcast media course by mistake. I ticked this course called integrated media. And when I got there, they were like, oh, you do a radio bulletin, a TV bulletin, and build a website and an article. And I was coming from public relations. I'm just like, what is all that? What are you saying? But when I was in campus, I was in USIU in Kenya. And we had a radio station, and I was invited on because I used to write poetry. I mean, I am a poet, and I was invited on a show on a Saturday to share my poetry. And so I shared my poetry, and the host told me to stay the entire show. And then the next Saturday, he called me back, and Saturday after that. What I didn't know, which could be like another conversation on my rights and consent, he was recording all our shows and sending those CDs out to different media houses. Then I got a call. I got a call from a station, and I was in my third year. I got a call from a station, and they're like, "Hey, this is One FM." At the time, I thought they wanted to interview me for poetry. So I was like, feeling like a bit of a celebrity. I'm just like, what day do you want me? And the programs controller is like, we actually want you for a job. Can you host a radio show? Of course, I had never done such a thing. Even though I was going on this radio show, I was sitting on the other side of the desk. He would turn on the mic, do all the technical stuff. I would just talk. And I said yes, as you do to opportunities. I was like, I'll land on the job. The job.
Yeah, exactly. And so many women actually don't do that. I mean, that's one of the things that we learn, isn't it? That actually the men are more likely to say yes to something that they have no knowledge about. Whereas we wait until we're very, very ready, like we've, got the PhD, like, and all that on the topic.
Exactly.
So it's also actually quite brave.
I was like, I'm just going to go. And I was like, I'll become friends with the producer. I will learn on the job. And that's how I got my first radio job. And I was thrown into the Drive show, which is a peak time show. And I had no experience whatsoever. And I kind of just had to like put one foot in front of the other. But it ended up being so natural. And I really fell in love with audio. I know the world is like video is king, but I think there's something magical about your voice, and there's an intimacy that audio has that video just will never give you. And I just kind of like put one foot in front of the other, became very close friends with all the producers so I could learn how to edit and run the desk. And that's how I got into radio. It was just by chance, and this guy recording the shows.
It's a combination of somebody believing in you, perhaps, right? And kind of knowing, okay, this person is going places, right?
Exactly.
So there is a gray line there on consent, but it kind of worked out for you, you know, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. But for those listeners of this podcast thinking about, okay, how do I do that? How do I just say yes to an opportunity where I know that I'm not entirely ready? Like reflecting on you doing that, what would you say you learned the most from having taken that big leap?
Yeah. And I think it's something I was doing even from before and even now. And now it's gotten a lot easier to know what I want to say yes to. And I think it's because I learned from a very young age just to say yes. I've worked in like a car, like Renault, they were selling trucks. I didn't know anything about trucks. I was doing some accounts thing.
Tell me you were selling trucks, okay.
I was doing I was like probably 17 or 18 and I just wanted to make money. And I think I lasted all of 1 month because I was just like, what are all these numbers?
Oh no.
What is happening here? So I didn't last. And then I also just remembered I said yes to a teaching job.
Okay.
I was going to teach primary school students how to swim because I swam competitively and even like represented the country throughout school. And I was like, oh, this is a nice way to make money around something that I like. I lasted one day, and and I was even remembering it. I was just like, man, I need to call that head teacher and apologize because I was 16. I just went silent. Like I did it for one day and then I stopped picking her calls because I was like, I hate this job so much. There are so many kids all talking at the same time. I can't do this.
Oh, no.
But you see, in saying yes to opportunities, you find out what you love and what you don't love. And it makes it so much easier. Like now I'm at the age where even with my business, it's so clear to me there are people who I wouldn't work with because it's not my path. And it's because of just exercising that muscle to find out what is for me, what is not for me. And I think it's also helped me understand the value that I have that can't sit on a degree. So I have a wealth of experience that I can even earn a living from that is not from like formal education. And it's from all of the things I've said yes to. I've been able to sit back and say, oh, I also have the skill. I also have the skill. And I think as women, we're always told to like tone down, like how to maneuver ahead is like, don't be too much.
Yeah.
I think there's like a man in a basement creating all of these these lies and just like cackling to himself because I'm like, tone down. Why would you want to reduce who you are? Like, why would you think being more in touch with your emotions is a weakness.
So it's going through that process of saying yes all the time to as many things as possible, but then gradually beginning to learn how to say no as you're beginning to find your path and being strategic about your no's, you know?
Yeah, so it's just like when you exercise the yes muscle, you get to fully know yourself and you get to build skills that you can even cost for later and earn a living from, you know? You don't have to tone down anything.
Yeah. And you're talking about your business, and you've built a whole lot of series of initiatives
Yep.
from She Will Connect to No Means No, Sisterhood, Unapologetically African. We've not even started talking about your podcast, right? So you got the Adelle Onyango Initiative, which basically does a lot of things, but still quite focused actually around empowering women, around sexual harassment, around kind of telling the African story, right? So all of these are really important objectives, really important issues. So reflecting on the amazing work you've done, we've talked a little bit about saying yes in order to find your path, but how did you get down this alley, this particular alley around empowerment and all of that?
Yes, absolutely. It's that. So now I'm exercising my no muscle. I'm now learning that I don't even have to quantify my no. It's a complete sentence.
Oh my God, sorry.
Yeah.
Just do it is my motto in life. That's my motto in life. Just do it. Get it started. Yes, it's crap. I remember, if you listen to the first few episodes of the podcast, you'll be thinking, oh my
Yeah.
God, what's you thinking of? But you learn as you go. But sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I just had to jump in there.
I think first I've always loved creating things and it was something that was encouraged when I was young. Like in my head, nothing is impossible to make and to do. And I don't have to have Beyonce budget. Like just just do it. It'll make sense as you go, you know?
It's organic, right?
Absolutely. No,
Taking a life
I
of its
hear
own.
you. And then also just like being around. So my mom and I were just not like mother-daughter. We were actually like best friends. She's now passed on. And it was when you're it's so much such close proximity to seeing someone using their life story to build something bigger than them that's helping other women. We used to have different women living with us because we lived in Nairobi, capital of Kenya. And at the time, there was only one government hospital where you could come and get chemo. So some women would only have the money for their chemo and not for finding where to stay. So our house, we had like women would come and live with us as they're getting their chemo. And so I think going through that, it was teaching me like, okay, something bigger than you, something bigger than you. And when I unfortunately then survived rape, I remember being very angry that I would not hear anyone talk about this. So I just was like, how are we operating like this is not happening? And I remember the first No Means No was birthed from anger, 100%, just being like, you guys are crazy. You're just going on with your lives and this madness is happening and we're acting like nothing, like everything is okay. And when I got together some of my friends, artists, and we did like a photo activism campaign called No Means No. And even if you see, as you've mentioned, all of these things, if you see the emotions even behind the words, you can kind of see almost like a glimpse of the healing or where I was at emotionally. Because I did No Means No and I used a lot of digital platforms. Back then, there was no Instagram, it was just Facebook, to understand what other countries were doing in terms of activism and in terms of sensitizing people on sexual violence. And, you know, I had friends who were in the UK who were like, oh, we go into clubs and we see these posters, and friends from Botswana, from Zambia, from Nigeria, and they would share these things. And it was just a platform for conversation. And then when I got into therapy, I was like, wow, this is actually helping me. I'd never done therapy in my life before then. And I talked to two friends who were therapists, and I was like, can you just offer free time on Saturdays? If somebody DMs me on Facebook and they want therapy, can you do this? So it was really, I don't even know what the English word is, but in Kiswahili, you say juakali when something is disorganized, but it's moving. Yeah. Yeah. And so Exactly. And so it grew. And then the next thing was kind of like having it grow into understanding the power of sisterhood. I was like, oh, this is such a beautiful thing for African women, especially like building those communities of sisterhood, be it around industries and emotional sisterhood, whatever it is. And so it became so beautiful to then now launch the sisterhood campaign and bring women together, even beyond sexual violence, just whatever it was we're healing from. And so I think I just, first and foremost, growing up in Estrogen FM, I was already biased to like women's issues, right? And then and then seeing my mom. And so it just, I really thrive when I'm working with women, when I hire women. I can't explain it. It feels so magical for me. And I'm now very focused on whatever comes naturally to me, I sit in it. I don't ignore it. Like that's something in your DNA or something, right? So that's kind of how it grew. And then by the time I launched the Adelle Onyango Initiative, it was kind of like to bring order in the house. You're like, okay, we've done all of these things. For it to be efficient, there needs to be structure. And we then zeroed in because I was trying to solve everything around sexual violence and it was frustrating. It's a big problem. There's cultural aspects, there's justice, the actual justice system, there is the medical system, and so
that was going to be my next question, actually, is that so you have this lived experience and the other kind of background experiences also that led you down a particular path and it was going organically. But the reality is that culturally, societally, there's so many other barriers to you even achieving any of the things you wanted to achieve, right? So what was the realities of trying to initiate all these ideas of bringing people together and trying to make that change?
I think initially I lived a very sheltered life. So I was always around very exposed people who just got it and who let me be me. So my friends and stuff. At the beginning, I hadn't become too visible in the public eye. So I was kind of sheltered. I was talking to people who got it, even on digital platforms. There were no trolls and things like that. But then now when I got onto radio, which was in 2010, I think I started actively talking about it maybe in 2011 on a public platform. Then the bubble bursts. And you're just like, oh, I thought everybody got it. Like, we're trying to make the world better for women. Who would be against that? Turns out quite a few people are against it. And it comes off as you're threatening the privilege or power that African men have. And, you start to understand that it's not as common sense as to everyone as it is to you. And so the major barriers were cyberbullying. Like that was intense. It was, and this is the point when the internet is taking off. So that anonymity has, the excitement around it is at an all-time high because people are just discovering this thing. And so you'll find that I remember once I was trolled for 24 hours, like morning to evening. And it was around speaking up for women. And it became, I heard all things, like it became a lesbian, which I didn't understand. I was like, how is this an insult? Like, I don't understand.
Yeah, exactly.
You almost want to ask the person, I think you need to revisit that insult. Bring another one. That one is not it. And I remember this tweet to date. Like there's a guy who tweeted and said, she even looks like she has HIV from that rape experience. And it was so, and I think for me, I was shocked for a couple of days. It was more shock before it became painful because it was like, are there human beings like this? Like, is this an actual human being behind this phone? Or like, am I dreaming all of this? Because how can someone who doesn't know me be so vile? Like, what have I done to this individual to cause them to be so mean to me? And I think at the beginning, I used to try and educate everybody who showed that they didn't get why we needed to ensure women's safety, why we needed to end sexual violence. Until I realized, I used to do that work, like every small person, like even if you insult me, I'm like, listen, read this article, like blah, 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 treat you and you're a stranger. Until I realized, hang on, you get it. You just don't want to lose your privilege. you're so comfortable in it, you don't want to lose it. One. Two, maybe there has been a moment where you have crossed the line, maybe a woman has told you no and you have kept on going, and you would rather insult me than face the reality of you actually crossed the line at one point. And so I then now, obviously, maybe age helps. Like, I'm a lot calmer. I wouldn't get into a back and forth fight with a stranger. I just started understanding that also what's important is stronger laws and stronger enforcement of laws. So I'm not going to stay here arguing with you. I just want to make sure that if, as you're justifying sexual violence, you go out and perpetrate this crime, like, that's just it. I'm not going to now sit in, because it's also re-triggering for me and I have to protect myself. But honestly, the blowback was cyberbullying, which I still get to date. But I mean, these platforms, they're not doing enough, but they're doing a bit. You can mute certain words. If you insult me and call me a toxic feminist, I will not see it. Since me.
Well, I mean, that's what I was going to say, that all of this was online violence, right? It's still part of the old gender-based violence dialogue, isn't it? Especially because you're trying to change the status quo. You're holding the mirror up to society to see itself, and people don't want to see that, just like you said. So, and you talk about being triggered in some of these things. How do you navigate that or balance that between trying to make the change and the impact for others while still protecting you?
It is so difficult. I'm thankful that I'm privileged enough to afford therapy. And even as of now, I have 2 therapists. And it's because, one is specifically around the blowback of sexual violence and experiencing that. But it's like you have to do so much more than the next person who is fighting, who hasn't experienced it, right? And so I've learned to first check in with myself and I don't attend. I think before I used to feel pressure to if something happens, I have to speak about it. I have to speak about it. I have to speak about it. And now a lot come. I don't attend every digital activism campaign or whatever. There's some I'll just sit out and not feel guilty, because I'm just at this moment, I only want to read poetry and sit in the sun. I do not have energy for this right now, guys. When I do, I'll come back. So I've learned to check in with myself. I've also learned, there's a very good friend of mine, Joaquin Gumi, and she's a powerful, one of those people in my sisterhood thing, and kind of checks in on me. And I remember her once, even with my podcast, and I recorded stories by other survivors of sexual violence. And she was the one who pointed out, you need to debrief. You need to debrief. Call your therapist and talk about debriefing. And that's something that completely helped me not get so re-triggered when I'm recording those stories, especially during the pandemic. There was a lot of stories I was recording because our cases tripled within 3 weeks of the lockdown. So I've learned how to not feel guilty about prioritizing my own health as a survivor, but still kind of getting the work done. What also helps is having a sisterhood and just kind of tapping out and knowing that there wouldn't be silence on this issue. There's other women who are shouting about it. And then when they can't handle it, kind of throwing it back to me, and I'm okay, I got it. We can do this. But it's also delicate. There's sometimes that you will still get re-triggered. You might think you're fully okay and you start having that conversation and you get re-triggered. There are moments where even with media interviews, as I said, I'm exercising that no muscle, because I've had moments where I've forced myself to go for them because I'm this is a point to amplify this issue and stuff. And I remember once going for an interview, I hated that I became the token survivor, yet I had things I wanted to share about what policies need to change. It's a live TV interview. It's so hard to jump in and say, I have something to say about this and all of that. And when I was leaving, one of the producers, because unfortunately my experience was on a back street, and one of the producers, a man, so I was leaving the interview, and this producer says to me as I'm leaving, "Oh, just make sure you don't get into any dark alleys again." And he laughs. And I remember being so angry. I don't get angry often, so I still remember how that rage was that night. And at first I was mad at myself because I'd started getting uncomfortable with the media interviews I was doing. And I was okay, so why did you put yourself in that situation again, in that environment again? in my head, I keep saying I'm doing the interviews to like push change. But if a producer of this show is making such jokes based on what I've just said I've experienced that was so traumatic,
Mm.
are we really making any change? Like, is that person able to even produce this in a manner that it impacts? I just
Yeah. It makes you question whether you can trust them with your story, right?
Exactly. And so I think for me, then it was just a situation where it made me question. And this was years ago. And it's only now I'm coming to the point of rejecting interviews and being able to vocalize and say, no, I'm not in a position to come on your show. Maybe at that point, I'm going through some sort of trigger or etc. But I've gotten to the point where even if I don't trust your platform, I'm not going to come and talk about it. And I don't feel guilty about it, you know? So that was not fun. That was absolutely terrible.
Yeah, and I mean, African Women in Media, we've been doing a project and we're going to be doing it for the next 3 years and focused in Nigeria, though, on media reporting violence against women and girls, because we recognize on two fronts. So you have the kind of sensitivities in terms of media content, right? And how the language, the way in which they deal with survivors and victims in their stories, right? And the need for us to improve the practice around that. But then also on the other side, because AWIM, as you know, works with women journalists, right? About the trauma that they face reporting on violence against women and girls, you know. And what we found so far is that actually there's a lot of the people that we've been working with themselves, aware on or otherwise, experiencing trauma as a result of these stories. So there's a two-pronged approach really in terms of making sure that things like what the producer said can never happen again, right? Making sure that we're developing a media force that we can entrust with such sensitive stories, and that their personal biases or personal perspectives has no place in how the media reporting. And then, but then also making sure that the environment in terms of the organizational policies and all that prevents these kind of things happening, but then also making sure that the journalists and the reporters who are reporting on this themselves have coping mechanisms to make sure that they themselves are able to perform their roles adequately.
And I think that's so important because even if you read reports, I know there was a report done in Kenya even on sexual harassment, and media houses were leading as organizations that had, a high number of sexual harassment cases. Then how do you expect them to be able to report on things when it's happening right in their organization and there's no policy, there's no framework? They don't even see harassment as harassment. I think for me, it's like there's a lot of workshops that need to happen, but even locally for us with like Media Council, Communications Authority, they say they have workshops, but I'm like, who created this workshop? What sort of validation has it gone through? Has it even passed through Survivors Network of Kenya to always, because I believe these things must always center survivors because they are such an insight into them. So it's also like when you tick a box and say, well, we have this workshop and we have this, I'm like, but what is the quality of this workshop? Is it even relevant to like present day? Has it evolved with even including things like online violence, And so, what the work you're doing, I hope it extends after Nigeria.
I hope so too. I hope so too. But it's been such an interesting few months. We only just started this second half of this year, and it's going to run for 3 years, like I said. But it's been really interesting. Currently we're having this conversation about these two girls who fought over a guy, and then the family of the other girl then to kidnap this other girl and beat her up. The conversation is, well, okay, which angle?
Yeah.
How do you tell the story without trivializing it with that narrative of two girls fighting over a guy, right?
Exactly.
Because it's a lot more than that, So it's just those kind of things where you really understand the crux of the matter and, don't fall into the usual kind of tropes of victim blaming, of saying, well, this happened because she did this,
Exactly.
that kind of thing. She shouldn't have stolen her man, that kind of thing. Whereas that's not the story. There's a crime that's been committed. And how do you report that in a way that's sensitive and true to the story?
What's interesting is at AWIM 2019, that was the workshop I did because what was irritating was you read in local Kenyan press a story about sexual violence and a woman. I remember once there was a woman who was raped, and when the article talked so much about the perpetrator, but it was things on he never drank, he never smoked, he had this number of degrees and PhDs. And so I was like, what are you trying to do? Yeah. Like there's
You're
so
trying to say
many.
it was a mistake. He's such a good citizen.
Yeah. And then it also makes it, you're also like saying perpetrators look a certain way. So they drink, they
Yeah.
smoke, they are not learned or whatever. And at no point, so I was even like, you need to tap into even specialists in different areas. So we're not writing enough about our inability to collect evidence and preserve it as a country. We're not writing about the judiciary and the biases that some of the judges have, the cultural biases. How does that affect justice? We don't even have a therapist come as part of that article to talk, so an expert. So you're not sanitizing this person. And they'll use different words like villains.
This
And
is
I'm like,
this is
this is
not
a
a thriller
criminal.
book, right? Yeah.
Like, that's a character. And so I think, there's a long way, and media is so instrumental, so much responsibility, and we're just not tapping into it right.
Talking about media and tapping into things right, you got your podcast,
Yes.
Legally Clueless, and you tell amazing African stories. First of all, explain that title, because I still don't get it.
Yeah. I know everybody's like, so are you a lawyer? I'm just like, no, not at all. So I worked as a radio presenter for 10 years. And when I was leaving, actually, I think I keep on referring to AWIM 2019 because it was the first event I did after resigning from my job. And I left a breakfast show on the top radio station in Kenya. We were the number 3 most listened to breakfast show. And the top 2, one was in Kiswahili. So there's no way we were ever going to beat it. So I literally left at a point when everyone would think is the point you stay.
Yeah.
And I just
talk about taking brave steps.
Right? And I was like, I'm turning 30. I hate this job. I hate the environment. It's not challenging anymore. I can do this show in my sleep. I want more. And we were a pop entertainment station. I realized I didn't have opinions on anything entertainment. I genuinely didn't care. You would tell me a story, my co-host, God bless him, would tell me a story and I'd just be, so-and-so is dating so-and-so. What do you think? And I'm like, well, I don't know why I should think anything. It's not my relationship, so why should I give a damn? And I just was realizing, okay, I've expanded past this space. It's time to get out. And when I left, I thought I was going to go into the NGO world and do more of the work around ending sexual violence. And a friend, he told me about podcasts. I'd never listened to a podcast before then. I didn't even know what the heck that was really. He was like, oh, you should listen to a podcast. And I Googled, what do you need? And obviously, when you resign, you're not trying to dip into your savings because you don't know what the future is looking like. And I was like, I'm going to Google, but I don't think I'm going to purchase anything. And I saw USB microphones and I was like, wow, I can afford 2 comfortably. All right. I have my laptop. I can just upgrade it. And that's how Legally Clueless started. And I remember I started constructing the extra room in my apartment. I made it into a home office stroke studio. And it was the first time we call them fundis, the workmen. They are known for just taking forever to finish projects. But this is the first time the fundi was on time, on schedule. My microphones arrived on time, on schedule. So the only person who was stopping the process was me and my fear of failure and fear of the unknown. And I called that same friend. He's my best friend. And I called him and I was crying. And I cry a lot. So he's just I don't know what I've done. I put in my resignation. Should I go back and be I'm serving my notice at this time? And he's so he said, then record that, record what you're feeling right now. And I literally hung up and I started recording and that name came to me and it just came to me. I was just I actually don't know what I'm doing and it's okay. And I'm almost soothing myself it's okay not to know, it's okay. And that's where Legally Clueless came from. It's just you are allowed not to know, you're allowed to be clueless. In fact, all of us really are. We just kind of are winging it. And I think the first 5 episodes, I would share the things I was
Mm.
navigating. And, in those moments, my grief became more intense because my mom would be the person I would talk to about things, go through contracts with. And I was like, oh my God, I got to do these things alone. And so I would talk about those things. And then I realized I don't have a monopoly on the human experience. And I was also like thirsty to know like other African stories. And it started off like I just whipped up my contacts, my phone, went through my contacts, literally went through everyone. I'm like, yeah, whenever I hang out with this guy, he has lots of stories. I'm going to ask him, hey, this guy, I actually don't know his story and I'm sure there's one. I'm going to ask him to come on. And I kind of like I set a target of like, so the feature where the stories sit is called 100 African stories because I thought it would take me 10 years to record 100 African stories. And it didn't. We're at episode 189. Like,
Oh gosh.
just after like we're in our third year and it's like we've had an episode out every week. And so I tell people now, oh no, I meant hundreds of African stories. And it's been so expanding to record because we've grown. As of now, we're a new media company. So we have the audio podcast. We have 3 seasons of a video series. We have a tour series. So we went to across Kenya on a tour. We went to Dubai twice, to Paris, to Zimbabwe. And I think Zimbabwe was the one that I felt like this is why I'm doing this work because it's been the story of that country has been told through Western lens. And when I went there for myself, I was like, this place is magical. Like I would live here. I just felt so spiritually tethered there. And I was like, this is why I'm doing this work to be able to have us tell our own stories, And we started workshops to help upskill Africans and wellness events because I'm really big on like, you have to be whole inside. So like yoga and group therapy stuff. And it's just crazy that all of this started from a podcast. And episode 1 is 8 minutes. Coming from traditional radio, that felt like eons to me. I was just like, why am I still talking? Because we had talked for like 1 minute long on traditional radio. And my voice was shaking. And I still, when I look at my insights, I still see it's like one of the top listened to. Because I guess when people come in and discover the podcast, they start there. And I'm like, why can't they start from episode 2? Why do they have to go? I think it's beautiful as well to like look back and just be like, wow, my voice was shaking. I was crying. And it's just beautiful how it's grown organically,
Well, a combination of things about thinking of leaving that job that they're not quite happy with. And they like, they know what they want to do, but they're kind of scared. So what would you say to them? And then 2, in terms of like starting something like a podcast. And, not only have you successfully grown the podcast and your initiative, but you are an influencer, right? You kind of have this influence. And I don't know whether not everybody likes that word influencer. So please, but you understand what I'm saying, right? But the impact that you've had and that you continue to have, like in hindsight, would you have done things differently? Or what would you say is, for those people just starting that journey, what would be your one thing that you'd say to them?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things actually. One, it's fear is normal. It's like a normal emotion. I think there was a time I thought you enforce a decision when you're at a point of no fear. But now I know there's never a point you have no fear. Like it'll always be there. You just have to ensure it doesn't win. And I've also understood that you need to name your fears. I think for a long time I was writing, in your resignation, you have this line, it's been a great 3 years working here. I used to have to keep editing that because it took me 4 years to resign. Actually, you used to have to keep going back. It's been a great 5 years. It's been a great 6 years. It's been a great 7 years. And I was just like, oh my goodness, when am I going to do this? And I think the breaking point for me was when I started naming my fears. And so I was like, okay, what are some of these fears you have? I have a fear of not being financially stable. Great. What can we do to ensure that you will be financially stable, and kind of like working back from there? So savings, investing in certain things, and just knowing that, okay, when I leave my job for 2 years, I'm going to be okay financially. And then that fear kind of reduces, right? And then saying, okay, another fear is fear of failure. Okay, let's define this failure thing. And I think especially that one, I realized failure is not a thing. It actually doesn't exist. It's not a thing. I know like motivational talks, they'll be like, fail forward. I'm just like, but it's not a thing. Like it doesn't exist, you know? And so I always just believe if something doesn't work out the way you thought, there's higher powers at play, and it's just like the universe nudging you back into your destiny path. It's not a, oh my goodness. And you can't also reduce your entire being to like a bad grade or a bad assignment. Like, so I'm just like, I don't think failure is a thing, guys. Like we manufactured this, it doesn't exist. And so naming your fears makes it easy for you to figure out how to ensure they don't win. And some of them, we just do this thing where we sit in fear. We're like, oh, I'm too scared. And you don't do anything. But when you name them, then you can be like, okay, the solution here is like, I need to do ABCD. I need to give myself a deadline. I need to, I can't sit in this thing. And the other thing, which funny enough, I was talking to a friend about it recently, is you're always told, don't resign from a job before you have your next thing. But I think sometimes advice needs to evolve with the times, because if you are in a toxic workplace, you will not have the mental capability to figure out what the next is. It just will not be there. So the advice then needs to be, okay, how can we make sure that, yes, it's a capitalist system. How do we make sure that financially you're covered when you get out, so that you then have a conducive environment to figure out, hey, what's going to be my next thing? So you're not making a decision of your next job from desperation, from fear or whatever. It's like a more calm, grounded decision. And I battled with that piece of advice, because you're told that from when you join the workforce. Don't leave one until you have the next one lined up. And I'm like, what is the next one? I've been doing this media thing for 10 years. I don't know what else I'm good at, And so as soon as I handed that resignation, in a week, I knew I was going to go into podcasting. It speaks to what it does for your mental once you're out of that space, even once you've accepted, oh, I'm leaving, And I think just start. Your life doesn't have to look like the next person's life. So it doesn't have to look like wearing a suit and going into an office. It doesn't have to look like, I live in a farm town now, and it doesn't have to look like riding a tractor and harvesting things, right? All of those things are work. Mine, most of the times I do night shifts. So I will be very easy and chill during the day. And then at 6 p.m., I know, okay, my night shift is starting. So doesn't have to look like you have to change that mindset, and it'll be okay. Nothing is ever a crisis, everything will work out. Everything is working for your good. You just have to accept that.
Earlier this year, your book, Our Broken Silence, was published, which you co-authored with, is it Lanji Oku?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes, Lanji Oku. And do you know it was meant to be a podcast?
Well, you got to tell us about that journey.
Lanji, she's Kenyan, but she's based between Kenya and New York. And she'd reached out because when I left my job, I started 2 podcasts, and then I had to retire one because it was just now too expensive to maintain. And it was a live podcast where men and women would come and talk about gender issues. And she watched a couple of episodes, and she's from a legal background. She runs a legal bureau. And for her, she's doing a lot of research into access to justice for survivors, etc. And so she reached out and she's like, oh, we can work and partner on an episode. And the more we dug deep into it, we were like, this is a lot. Maybe it's even a season, not one episode. And then we kept digging. And I remember she was like, this is a book. And my first reaction was fear, because in my head, I was like, have I experienced enough in life to write a book, honestly? And those things like when I'm in my 60s and now I'm wise after years of experience, now I can share. And it's just like, it's great. Again, sisterhood, to have someone nudge you and be like, no, there is a lot you can say, and let's dig deep, and we can amplify other stories as well. And Our Broken Silence was born. And so it's a diary entry format of stories of survivors of sexual violence, and also people in their families, so in their support system, people from the medical field, people from the legal field. It includes vulnerable communities like the LGBTQ plus communities as well. And it looks at stories from pre-colonial time in East Africa to present day. And then you see running themes. Like it's almost one of those things where it's like the more things change, the more they stay the same. And we both have chapters. So for others, I think what's powerful is to be able to have different ways people tell their stories. There's some that are one paragraph, and then there's some that are pages. There's some that's one sentence, and it's like just so, and exploring the emotional themes that come with both being a survivor and being someone who wants to help. You're working in the judicial space, but you're not equipped with what you need to be able to make this change. And it's a helplessness that you're experiencing. And then to my bits, I think because we started writing in 2020, and that was one of the silver linings of the pandemic, is to be forced to pause. Obviously, there's a privilege in me saying that, but like I'm being able to be still and silent enough to explore, okay, where am I in my healing journey? And to talk about things like even just rebuilding yourself as an African woman in a sexual sense after sexual trauma. It's bad enough we don't even talk about sex as Africans. Now add sexual trauma and trying to navigate that. It's like, hey, I think now you're going too far, and being able to like explore those themes and say I'm rebuilding, or even like what relationships look like, talking about my views on, universities that have failed to keep their students safe. And for me, it's such a powerful journey. And we've realized that it's more than a book. So now we're going into the proceeds support two things. One, it supports a fund run by Lanji's company that helps first give survivors access to pro bono legal services, helps relocate them because a lot of them are dealing with it while being in that same abusive environment. So we've been able to relocate some and kind of like build a house for one particular survivor.
Wow.
And then also the funds go to my initiative. So we have a program called Safe 247, which is a free group therapy program across 14 weeks for survivors of sexual violence. And it's free so that a survivor doesn't have to think about getting the money for this vital intervention. And we've realized that it's more than a book. So we're now exploring training, really being led by Lanji, training the members of the judiciary on like, you guys have a bias when you're doing these cases. I mean, there's one judge who, in a case of defilement, a minor defiled by an older man, he said this girl looked ripe and she went to that house, so she was looking for sex. So if that's what she's looking for, this is not a crime. And that's the judge, So even while we have conversations of evidence preservation, there is a training the judiciary needs to go through to be aware of their cultural bias and how harmful it is. So it's funny, it started as a book, but it's like so much bigger, and we're exploring other themes, exhibitions, films, and it's just, I don't think I've even really sat in like, oh my God, this is actually a big thing. I think the fear sometimes makes me run away, where I'm just like, it's a book, go on Amazon, buy it, read it, and then I run away. But it's like, it's something that I'm going to be doing for a very long time. Yeah.
I think there's a consistent thing there in your story of just doing it, just like we said at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Yes, there's all the ifs and what happens and but just doing it. And then when you do it, you're taking on this magical journey where you just, you start with imagining 100 podcasts in 100 years, and you're at 189 in 3 years, right? So same thing. I mean, I would not be surprised if this time next year, me and you are meeting up somewhere and, you're winning an Oscar, for best international whatever documentary on whatever, that kind of thing. And I think what your story tells us is that, you take the first step and you'll be surprised where the journey will take you.
Absolutely. Like my friend, again, the one who I really should give him shares, because like who got me into podcasting. And whenever I'm freaking out and I tell him and I'm like, what if it fails? And and he's like, this is a waste of energy, because why couldn't you put this energy into thinking about what if it succeeds? So I always go back to that when I start panicking over something. I'm like, actually, let's sit in the thoughts that if it succeeds, and it's so beautiful to be like, yeah, it will be so magical. It should be so and you feed the idea of this good, positive energy instead of this dark, oh my God, it's not going to work.
So I know we're kind of covering this question already, but briefly, what next for Adelle?
Oh my goodness. I think what I've tapped into quite organically is being part of conversations on Pan-Africanism and kind of like trying to rebuild my African identity. And it's a conversation that I thought I was not ever going to be part of because I thought you had to have degrees and PhDs, history, those things. And through the work that I've been doing in like recording African stories, I know it's our vision, but I didn't realize that we are actually doing it. We're helping Africans not only learn about each other, but learn about themselves and dig deep into their own identity. And I think I've pivoted, obviously still biased to African women, but there is a drive I have that is very Pan-African. And before I used to say, I want to be on the forefront when you're talking about new media on the continent. I want my name to be on that list. And to a great extent, I have achieved that. But I think that statement was coming from ego. And now the statement is backed by, because I want to kind of like wake Africans up again and like tap in power, go back into who you are, rebuild your identity. You're amazing. You're dope. You're creative. And you're worthy the way you are, whether you're traditional or you're more modern or you swing across both, that's enough as you are as an African. And so now what I'm really focused on is like touring across Africa with Legally Clueless Africa and being very intentional about that and being involved in more of those conversations. So I'm going back to Zimbabwe soon to be involved in conversations around bringing back our objects and artifacts from colonial museums. And it's crazy because if you told me, even like 5 years from now, if you were like 5 years back, you're like, you'll be involved in this, I'd be like, but I don't even understand those things. I didn't study that in history. I'll be like, you are mad. I will be stuck in media. And I just have understood that my calling is so much higher in terms of an African awakening. And then my medium to achieve that calling is this new media thing that I'm doing. So it's not the other way around as it was before. And so, yeah, I think that's what I'm tapping into now.
Adelle Onyango, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. What's an inspiring story?
Thank you. You are such a natural in this. This is so beautiful. Like it's after like delayed flights and things, this is exactly what I needed. My spirit and my energy is lifted. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Adelle's episode was one of resilience, courage, patience, and taking that leap of faith that a lot of us wish we could take at various points in our lives and our career. So I do hope you found Adelle's story uplifting and encouraging. If you'd like to join me on an episode of this podcast, please contact me at yemisi@africanwomeninmedia.com. You can also visit our main website at africanwomeninmedia.com to find out more about our work. In the show notes, there's a list of organizations and helplines to support you if you have experienced any of the topics we have discussed today. And don't forget, join the conversation using hashtag HerMediaDiary.
Her Media Diary is a product of African Women in Media, an NGO advocating for gender equality in the industry. This episode was hosted by Dr. Yemisi Akinibobola and produced by Fadila Sadal as a part of 5 podcast series on sexual harassment in the media. All music featured in this podcast is by Nana Kwabena. Thanks for listening. Join us again next time.